So with those regulators that have introduced an innovation office, they have issued guidance. So maybe, for example, by interacting with the businesses through these different initiatives, it becomes clear that there's a particular issue or a particular area which is unclear and needs some clarification, and so the regulator can put forward maybe a short policy piece or a clarification note, some guidance to help the industry to know where they stand. If they're being asked lots of people and they're responding with the same response, then maybe it's more efficient to just put out some information to help the industry understand what that is. Actually changing the regulatory requirements. I think we heard from one of the gentlemen here actually identifying maybe your regulation or legislation bans or prohibits a particular type of technology for some reason. And when you're speaking to the industry through your engagement with the Innovation Office or Regulatory Sandbox, you realize that actually this is a major problem for innovation, and this is stopping new businesses developing, this prohibition on technology. And so maybe there needs to be a change in regulation. I think this has been relatively rare so far, but definitely relevant. I believe a good example of this is World Remit, which is a well-known remittance company. And they were working with the Malaysia Securities Commission, I think it was, or one of the Malaysian regulators, to look at electronic KYC. And within the legislation, there were kind of lack of clarity and issues about the use of non-person-to-person verification. And so going through this process with their regulatory sandbox helped to provide some clarity and I believe some changes to the regulation as a result of that process. And finally here, you can see of all of the regulators that have introduced a regulatory sandbox, almost 40% of them have said that it's too early to tell whether or not there's been a positive impact. So it's quite uncertain and maybe quite difficult to know if a regulatory sandbox has achieved its objectives. Has it done what it was set out to do? So that's definitely something to keep in mind. So for innovation offices, this is where, so this study was done in early 2019, and at this time, these are the jurisdictions that had a regulatory sandbox or a dedicated fintech team. Since then, I know in Colombia, in Brazil, in Chile, and I'm sure that there are other countries as well that are not included here that have a dedicated team that are focused on financial innovation. You can see here, so where the Innovation Office has a red circle is where the regulator has said, right, our objectives, our mandate is to focus on financial inclusion. The Innovation Office has to make sure that it focuses on businesses that are looking at financial inclusion. So for example, I believe that is the case with in Indonesia with OJK, and in Malaysia as well, really focusing on how innovation that's emerging can be focused on the national objective of being able to promote financial inclusion. So innovation offices, here are a summary of kind of the key lessons learned. So it enables regulators to engage with the innovators. It helps to reduce regulatory uncertainty. So I think, if you look from the perspective of an entrepreneur who's trying to raise capital to get investment for their business, and they're in a situation where the kind of regulation is very unclear for them, then this makes it very difficult for them to raise investment and to grow and to kind of deliver on what they have planned. So regulatory clarity is really, really important for businesses operating in the market. Also, I think innovation offices having that feedback, that point person within the regulator can help to make sure that the entrepreneurs and the fintech firms are thinking about consumer protection. So when they're building their products, that they get that feedback so that when they're building their products, when they're building their apps or their their different products and services, that they can take that into consideration. Maybe these people don't think about consumer protection as something that they need to consider, but having that point of interaction can change how they're actually building their products. So it's a great opportunity for a regulator to get in early when a product or service is being built. And also, I think just the regulator taking a very proactive and positive response to innovation can also help to kind of stimulate market activity. It can encourage either innovators within the country to start thinking about, okay, well, how can we create a new fintech product that is focused on financial inclusion? Or maybe there are entrepreneurs in other countries that will see, hey, this country is kind of really promoting innovation within their market. Maybe we should look at this as somewhere to go and start providing our products and services. And I think just finally here, I mean, having kind of leadership and kind of institutional support at a very high level is really important for these different initiatives, for innovation offices, but also for regulatory sandboxes and RegTech as well. I think CGAP found that, I think it was around 80% of the initiatives that were created within regulatory sandboxes and innovation offices had the support at kind of governor level, or very, very senior level in terms of the regulators to get that support, which kind of, maybe there's a very small team that will be dedicated to promoting innovation, but if it comes from that kind of leadership and very high level, then that can kind of permeate across the whole organization as something that needs to be focused on. Another thing to consider, if you're thinking about, okay, should we introduce an innovation office or should we introduce a regulatory sandbox? Here, as of early 2019, is the total number of businesses from the 110 countries that we'd surveyed that have used either an innovation office or a regulatory sandbox. I believe only 180 firms had used a regulatory sandbox by early 2019, but 2,100 or so firms had used an innovation office. It's much lighter touch, less resource intensive, you would spend less time, actually get on the phone to somebody, meet someone, maybe you'd have some promotion and marketing material to help raise awareness about the type of issues or how to get in touch and be able to follow up. So a much more kind of resource efficient way to make sure that you're interacting with innovators. So I don't know, for the regulators here, I mean, does innovation officers, now that we've spoken about this, is this something, are you looking to build your fintech team? So I know, who was it? I think there were two people here that said the team is currently about 10 people. For the other regulators, how many people do you think are kind of currently working in innovation or fintech, and do you see these teams growing? Could you maybe comment from your perspective? Sorry. Okay. Yeah. Fantastic. So you just introduced a regulatory sandbox, and how many people work in there? Okay. Okay. Fantastic. Thank you. Okay. Is that within which institution is that?
In Bangladesh Bank. Bangladesh Bank is the central bank of Bangladesh. So 5 to 7 people are working for innovation. And in the ministry we have also the innovation team that link with the other innovation team, that link with the financial institutions.
Fantastic. So five to 7 people in the central bank, that was?
Yes.
Yep. Brilliant. Thank you. How about in Mongolia?
Helping the new participants of the payment system and help them to get a license and everything like that.
10 people, and that's kind of more outward looking, so it's engaging with the industry, helping them through the authorization process. Okay, fantastic, thank you. Any other comments, or should we move on? RegTech, we're going to spend a fair amount of time on this afternoon, so I won't touch that now. And now we're kind of moving into regulatory sandbox, where it's taken a bit of time, but I thought that was kind of useful context. So some regulators, before kind of regulatory sandboxes took off in around 2014, this idea of being able to let innovation kind of evolve, don't kind of make it prohibited or take legal action, or to basically allow it to evolve, to test and to learn. And this kind of concept we see here in the Philippines, so with e-money regulation in 2004, so kind of ad hoc registration of e-money firms. In Tanzania in 2008, so the Bank of Tanzania began to allow mobile operators to operate, even though the kind of regulatory framework was unclear. Obviously, M-Pesa as well, around this type of period as well, in terms of allowing this business to operate without a kind of a formal regulatory framework in place to kind of test and learn and see how that evolves. And it wasn't really until 2014 when the UK's Project Innovate and the Innovation Hub started talking about regulatory sandboxes. So before that, there was much more kind of informal and ad hoc test and learn approaches. So the example here within the Central Bank of the Philippines, BSP, 2004, permission to allow non-bank to pilot e-money with safeguards and reporting in place. It wasn't until 5 years later that formal e-money regulations were actually introduced, and today testing and learn approach in terms of different eKYC and payments agents, so kind of ongoing innovation without kind of strictly defining what it is these activities are, but allowing some time for these innovations to kind of take root and see what impact they're having in the market. In China, a similar story with online lending, with internet finance, with peer-to-peer lending. So if you look here, so this is data from 2016. So in 2016, China accounted for about 80 to 85% of the global market for peer-to-peer lending. So businesses lending to consumers, lending to other businesses, anybody could go onto these websites and lend people money. And in China, many of the traditional banks were focused on serving kind of state-backed businesses and not so interested on small SMEs or consumers. So a huge underserved market. So many of these peer-to-peer lenders saw this as a fantastic opportunity. And you can see kind of 2010, 23 of these businesses started operating, and this was before there was any kind of regulatory action. 2011, 55 people, 2013, 572, 2014, 2015, you see this explosion of activity, like thousands and thousands of new businesses that are entering the market, and there was not any kind of regulatory response. The regulators were kind of waiting to see what happens. How does this industry evolve? Many of these are still very small businesses, right? They're not kind of a major problem, each one. But then there were several thousand of them. And you're talking about kind of, what's that, $250 billion each year. So it's a really sizable market that happened extremely quickly. And then from around 2015 onwards, the regulators started to introduce kind of changes that really cut the industry and started to introduce rules that meant that many of the providers were no longer permitted to operate, and now, well, that was 2018, about 1,000. We're currently collecting data for 2019. I imagine the number of providers is going to continue going down. So I guess this just kind of really highlights what could happen if the regulator decides to do nothing and just allows the industry to evolve with no kind of real formal guidance or no controls or no kind of specific regulations that can help to address this. Sometimes kind of activities can just really kind of grow very, very quickly, and have a lot of kind of consumer harm. So many consumers that had borrowed money from these platforms, some of the entrepreneurs would just run away with their money, or there were, for example, taking collateral in loans. There were some very, very kind of bad practices that were happening in terms of irresponsible lending. But none of these businesses were regulated. None of them had any kind of consumer protection or kind of any guidance about how they should operate or know if they should be regulated. So this kind of test and learn approach, there's a few different examples of that. But now let's have a look at regulatory sandboxes. So regulatory sandboxes, you can see here, are happening in many, many different countries globally. I think there's around 50 or so in different countries now. This is a little bit old, sorry. It's about 9-10 months old, this data, so I'm sure some of this has changed. But you can see in green are the countries that have a regulatory sandbox or had a regulatory sandbox in place. The orange are in the process. So, for example, Brazil, the central bank in Brazil, they will launch their sandbox, I believe, in December this year. So many countries are in the process, and I think we heard from one of our colleagues here today who are also in the process, and in India just recently have introduced, was it the RBI? Yes, in August. Okay, so yep. And then also a lot of countries that are kind of in the process of considering it. So it has really become a global phenomenon. And as a kind of a formal definition, regulatory sandboxes are formal regulatory programs for market participants to test new financial services or models with live customers. And I think that's a key point. So they're testing with real people, real customers, but with certain safeguards in place and oversight from regulators. So that's how we would define a regulatory sandbox. Obviously, there are so many different approaches to regulatory sandbox. I think even the definition of a regulatory sandbox will differ from country to country, depending on why you've established a regulatory sandbox in terms of your objectives and what you're trying to achieve with it, how you're measuring it. Different countries are going to take very different approaches. So a sandbox is a way to live test new products or services. Most sandboxes will give a certain amount of time, or they will give a certain scope, some of which we can run through in terms of how these innovations are being tested. And this process will help the innovators to kind of understand how they're going to be treated in terms of the regulatory framework. And it also gives the regulator time to think about where they fit in the regulatory framework. And also will help the innovator to hopefully operate safely and in a regulated manner where relevant as they go forward. So that's kind of what a sandbox is, but there has been quite a lot of kind of misconception, I think, from the industry and from regulators potentially about what a sandbox is. So a sandbox is not a permanent license to operate. A sandbox is not kind of a regulatory mandate or authorization to be able to operate. It's not a free pass to operate without supervision or oversight. And it's probably not so relevant when an innovator can clearly understand how they should be regulated. So for a business or an activity that is very clearly defined already, then you shouldn't need a sandbox for that, because you should already know where you fit in the regulatory framework. Also, I think a regulatory sandbox is not something that is to test your business model. It's not a way for the regulator to kind of support you as an entrepreneur to develop your business and to give you time and money and endorsement to be able to kind of test your business model. So that's something I think maybe some entrepreneurs think, oh, fantastic, I can come into this regulatory sandbox, my investors are going to be really happy because the regulator now supports my business and that will help me to raise money and go forward, and I'm going to have regulatory clarity as well. So there's a real kind of danger there that there's that kind of misperception of what the regulatory sandbox is. So if we look at what a regulatory sandbox is compared to, say, the test and learn approach, what we were looking at with M-Pesa or the Central Bank of Philippines or in China, for example. So the test and learn approach is really where, okay, so we'll let these mobile money operators in Tanzania operate, but they will have certain safeguards and we're going to have certain restrictions in place that these firms have to comply with. And yes, we, the regulator, we will speak to these firms and we will understand them. So that could be the test and learn approach. But for a regulatory sandbox, it is also, so yes, we will give restrictions and safeguards for your innovation. Yes, we will speak to you and understand you and make sure that we are able to build our knowledge and capacity about what you do. But also, it's a much more kind of structured and defined process to deal with innovators. It's not so ad hoc. So everybody in the market will understand the process that has been communicated very clearly and is very kind of logical and ordered to help kind of deal with innovation. It's also kind of a permanent or semi-permanent state of affairs. So this regulatory sandbox process will be here for many years potentially. So it's kind of a formal framework for dealing with innovation. Also, a regulatory sandbox is about focusing on an objective. So for you as a regulator, kind of thinking about how does that align with your mandate, with your kind of institutional objectives, if that relates to financial inclusion or promoting competition or whatever it may be. So the sandbox needs to connect with your institutional objectives. And also making sure that the process is objective and publicly available so everybody can understand the process involved to get on board with a regulatory sandbox. Hopefully you can see kind of the differences between a more informal, ad hoc test and learn process versus a much more kind of structured, resource-intensive approach with a regulatory sandbox. So that's a sandbox generally, but what we've seen in quite a few different countries is there are different types of sandbox. So, for example, here are kind of 4 main ones, and I'm sure maybe you've heard of other ones, or maybe you're thinking about doing something different in your own jurisdiction, but here are kind of 4 key sandbox models. So firstly is innovation promoting. So a sandbox that's really looking at providing a space for innovators to test an innovation that is unclear about where it fits in the existing regulatory framework. They will receive feedback on their business. They will be able to assess kind of the interactions between consumers in a live environment, and they will be able to change and tweak their product features in response to the kind of regulatory realities of the jurisdiction that they're operating in. So innovation promoting, this is where you can kind of test out a new innovation, see where it fits in the regulatory framework, and be able to change your business model to then go and launch in the market, or maybe there needs to be some changes potentially in the regulatory framework. So that's the first one. The second one really is about, the innovation promoting one, the FCA in the UK is an example of that. For policy promoting, really this is more about looking at the regulatory framework. What's wrong with the regulatory framework that needs to be changed? Not the business model or the innovator, but what are the problems with the regulation that is stopping, or the legislation that are stopping innovation from happening? So we heard from gentlemen here about the kind of technologies that are being prohibited in the existing regulation. Is that a barrier to innovation? Does that need to be changed? So really this type of kind of regulatory sandbox is for looking at that. And a good example of this is the Monetary Authority of Singapore. And I was talking to one of the people that leads that initiative there, and he just said basically, so we only have one and this was about 18 months ago, we only have one business that is in our sandbox, and we think that's a really good thing. Because if you had many businesses coming to you, that means you've got many problems with your legislation that are inhibiting innovation. So some regulatory sandboxes, they like to have a KPI or a performance indicator that says, look, we've helped this many firms, a big long list of firms that have been helped by this process. But for a policy promoting sandbox, maybe that is not a positive thing. Maybe you want very few problems with your kind of legislation or your regulation that need to be changed. So policy promoting sandbox to really ask the industry, okay, come to us, look at the legislation, look at what is happening and what needs to be changed. The third type of regulatory sandbox is more of a kind of a thematic regulatory sandbox. So this is really where a regulator or a government says, okay, we need to address this particular policy issue or this particular theme, and the sandbox will be there to try to promote innovation in this area, but also identify any problems in this area in terms of the regulation or the legislation. So maybe this is in relation to digital identity. I believe